information look like? So on the left, you are looking at raw canned data. It's split into three primary informations, which is the timestamp on the very left, and then the data, which is separated into two subparts. The left, which you'll see a small hashtag. On the left of the hashtag is the can identifier. That's indicating that this message is coming from this electronical control unit source. And then on the right is all of that data information. Note that this is all read to us as in hex, but in reality, it's all just binary. And then on the right is an example of a decoded DBC file. So one message of one identifier typically contains a multitude of many different submessages, all of which can be read and understood by us. So what does the J1939 look like? So J1939 data is very, very similar. It follows the same raw format, which is a timestamp followed by an identifier and all of the information outside of it. But you'll notice immediately that the identifier is significantly longer. I believe it's around 29 bits for what makes up an identifier as opposed to the usual 9 bits of a can ID. And to be elucidated, data actually looks like this. We just have a pretty nice and standard format, which I won't be getting into in depth, but this is the format of which we read it all in. So what was my research? As I mentioned earlier, the primary goal of my research was to try and apply the CANID's existing framework to J1939 trucks. However, there was also a multitude of smaller things I had to do. The secondary objective being that I needed to improve a lot of the as-if scripts because the scripts as they were designed were not really made to be tweaked around constantly. So you had to have ways of keeping track of all this information. So starting with the secondary objectives first. The first thing I looked at was a system called the config files. The config files was the way in which the CANID systems kept track of where it got its data from and where it sent its data to once it was processed. And originally in the CANID system, these config files had to be done manually. You would have to go into the file and manually change information. The problem with this is that not only do you lose track of what was the past config file, so where you were getting your information from originally, but you can also severely mess things up if not done properly. So what I did was that I wrote a small bash script which will allow us to not only create backups and keep track of past config files, but also will allow us to create a multitude of config files so we can potentially run data on many different inputs many different times over. This was really, really important, especially because the config files were very important in creating the graphs you see here. So another issue was improving troubleshooting times. This was the biggest thing I had to tackle before I went into actually looking at the primary issue. So the troubleshooting, so when trying to tweak things around, you need to be able to do it quickly, and you need to be able to get results on your data quickly so that you can understand what difference each little tweak that you made has made on the system. But as you can see, on medium to large data sets, this one's called the Chattanooga field test. This was a test where a group of field collectors took the truck and drove it all the way out to Chattanooga and back and just collected running data. As you can see, it took 2 hours and 50 minutes for all of the data to be processed, and then an additional roughly 40 minutes for all of that data to be turned into binary that the system can actually use. And this is a pretty big problem, because if you're tweaking things as you go, you can't afford to wait 2 hours plus 2 to 3 hours each time just to see that the little tweak that you made resulted in something where you don't have any information and everything is unknown. So the main solution I found was that there was a major caveat to how the AI system worked, which was when the AI is collecting it, it's collecting all of the raw data, but oftentimes there are repeat messages from repeat ECUs and from repeat sources. So when you're testing, you only really need to check to see if it can do it once on one source once. You don't really care too much about how the things change over time. So what I did was that I wrote another script to take advantage of this fact. You could print all of the information you needed to the screen, and you could run multiple batches quickly. And the caveat is that because you're ignoring a lot of the repeat messages when you're doing this, you lose a little bit of the accuracy because you won't be able to capture everything at the same time. But this 3+ hour data set was able to be processed in like 5 minutes because of this. So we can troubleshoot things much quicker. So let's go to the primary goal now. So the first thing I needed to look at was how information is stored. So the information on what the J1930 standard is and how it's decoded is typically stored on a very large proprietary Excel sheet. This Excel sheet, by the way, costs upward of like $400 to purchase the full manual of. So when we had access to this, we needed a way to compactly and quickly feed that information into our script system. So, and this was my first time ever touching SQL, but we have a system called SQL, which is not a script, but it's something that you can write using Python or many other different languages, which allows you to transform large Excel sheets into binary and readable SQL documents and databases. And here's some of the code. Here's an example of some of the code that I wrote. So you'll notice the required field IDs. Those are all just columns in the Excel sheet indicating which is which. And you'll actually see this more in detail with the information lower, the PGNs, labels, acronyms, etc. I didn't know I could do that. And then, so once we have all of these compact databases, we then have to turn this into something called a JSON. JSON stands for a JavaScript object notation. It's the implementation used by the CanID system, which allows you to send all of these standards to the AI in a way that the AI can actually read and make sense of it. So that's what this script is. And then that script will turn it all into this. For those of you who are computer scientists here, you can treat JSON kind of like a giant dictionary containing all of the information you need to know. And then once we have all that information, we can hopefully send it to our AI models and get that DBC file we're looking for. So, obviously the big question, did it work? Well, not exactly. The closest case involved, there were quite a few failures. The first case I tried, it just failed to print anything. The second case, which is shown here, it failed to identify any messages whatsoever. And then the third and closest case we ever got into was it managed to identify something, but it kept duplicating that to where you would have one message be duplicated across all of these, which is incorrect, but it is identifying something. So there were a few reasons that I theorized, but I ran out of time to fully do research on these. But the first and foremost reason as to why this was the JSON format. So the OBD2 system and the J1939 system have some key differences. One of which is something called the PID and PIG hex. The PID stands for the parameter identifier. This is something that OBD2 uses, but it is not something that actually exists in J1939. So when we originally tried to just extrapolate and try to see if it would be able to run anyway, that could be causing some issues. There's also the issue of the model itself. The model had been largely trained on OBD2 and standard cars. So trying to see if it would be able to just run by itself on J1939 is tricky, to say the least. And then also there was another weaker reason in my opinion, which was there was lack of bit masking for identifiers. So whenever we ran a AI to do an identifier, we would try to see if it was possible to kind of hide the identifier information to see if the CanID system can rediscover and redetermine it with an obfuscated identifier. So yeah, in conclusion, J1939 applications are very possible. The CAN ID system's definitely going to have to need some rework, but it's very possible, and despite there being no concrete system for CAN IDs to handle J1939 yet, the research was largely successful in doing what it was meant to do, which was to be a proof of concept to see if J1939 can work. Great. Questions?
What questions do we have? Gianna?
Why would people want to hack into these systems?
That's a very good question. So typically when it comes to hacking cars, if you can hack into a car, you can probably just steal the car. Like you can break into it, hotwire it, and drive off with it. But hacking cars is a lot more subtle. And that's very bad, because hacking cars allows you to do things like monitor their GPS locations. So you could print a CAN hack into the GPS system of the car and monitor exactly where it lands. This is a big deal if you were to say, monitor the location of a military vehicle and track it to a unknown American base somewhere. And then you can also do things like have the GPS route to places that it's not originally routing to. So you can try to deliver items or contraband to places that they weren't originally supposed to be.
Good. Does the canvas that you were working on, does it have access to like different systems in the car, such as like steering and braking?
Yes, it has access to everything. Absolutely everything. From the steering to the brakes to the windshield wipers to the tail lights to the wheels themselves. When I went to go see them actually hacking the cars, they could do some really crazy stuff like brick the car entirely or make all of every single input device do random things.
Does every single car have CAN?
Yes and no. So pretty much every modern vehicle has some form of the CAN bus, but this is a relatively new technology. I don't know the exact date, but it's pretty relatively new, but much older vehicles do not have the CAN bus, or at least the CAN bus using OBD2 systems.
But every modern car produced from here on out already has.
Pretty much. There are very few caveats to that.
Maybe one quick thing you could speak to, and then I know you got to get out of here. What was it like working on a project where you were continually making mistakes, and how were your mentors throughout that process? Like, not mistakes so much as like learned experiences, I guess.
Yeah, so when I went into this project, I was a first year student. So that was a really big challenge for me. I did not know how to use SQL. I did not know how to use Bash. I did not know what databases were. I did not know any of that stuff. So I made a lot of mistakes along the way. But thankfully, I had a team of really good mentors, especially Dr. Luke Polk, if you have met him, he's a nice guy. But they were very helpful, and they were very kind to help me, push me in the right direction. They would always show me what I could be doing better, and it was really nice to have a team of mentors willing to help you.
Let's give Christian another round of applause. All right, and now we're going to be switching gears topic-wise quite a bit. You guys can go ahead. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started with our next presentation. We have two speakers for this one. We have Ellie Jaynes, who is a junior engineering major, and she will be starting her first leg of the 3-2 journey at UGK next semester. So we're going to wish her well on that. And then we have graduating senior Colby Huffman, who is a dual major in biochemistry and mathematics.
Hi everyone, I'm Ellie, this is Colby. Like Brett mentioned, this was our project last summer as part of the FIPSE grant. through Maryville College, and what we were studying was the quantitative analysis of anabolic agents in East Tennessee consumer meat, which might seem like a broad and confusing title now, but we're going to go into the definitions of that in a little bit. So just an overview of what we're going to talk about and where we're going. We're going to start with an introduction, tell you a little bit about our research aims so you can understand that better. Colby's going to go through our methodology, and we're going to tell you about our current results and acknowledgements. And this is a picture of Colby in the lab working on some computer stuff. So a little bit of introduction into why we kind of got interested in this project is basically, if you didn't know this already, in the US, a really frequently used method for expediting beef cattle growth for like human consumption especially is by using growth enhancers. So most of the like grocery store meat that you're purchasing is not natural and free of anything. A lot of it is used with growth enhancers, and some of the over-the-counter products that you can use for that are what we have here. You can see some pictures, Ralgro, Synovex, and there's lots of different types of that, and Revlar. And basically the way that works, if you haven't seen it or heard about it before, is there's little pellets that have the growth enhancers and different types of hormones and steroids inside. They inject that into the ear under the skin of the cow, and then that has a release time over the cow's life, and it kind of helps to beef them up. So here are some of the chemical compositions and structures of the active ingredients that are in these over-the-counter products. Like I mentioned, Ralgro, you can see lots of different types of Synovex, and then there at the very bottom are Revlar, and they have different type of active ingredients such as zeranol, progesterone, trenbolone. We're going to talk a little bit more about those and why they do what they do and some of the implications of them. So, like I just mentioned, a lot of those listed here. We have zeranol, which is main use for growth production, as you probably could have guessed. It does have some adverse effects on health because it's very estrogenic, and it actually is a mycotoxin. So that's one of the things that they're injecting into cows. Progesterone, this one is naturally occurring, but it plays a really big role in reproductive events, and a lot of these have a lot to do with reproductive events because they're hormones. Trenbolone is an anabolic steroid for growth production, and this one has some adverse effects on lots of major organs like your kidneys, liver, heart. Estradiol, which is an estrogen hormone, again has a lot to do with reproductive events, and it stimulates the pituitary gland, and that's kind of the mechanism that it uses to produce more of a growth hormone. Testosterone, again, you've heard of it, naturally occurring, contributes a lot to bone health and reproductive function, and obviously, as you can imagine, testosterone kind of helps beef those cows up, and it actually has it has adverse effects at either high and low levels. And then estradiol, which there's lots of different types that we're going to talk about, like 17-beta estradiol, that is a synthetic steroid, and it increases both nitrogen retention and growth rates, and it has adverse anabolic effects, which is a lot what we were looking into this summer. So this was, I thought, one of the most interesting parts of this project for me, because we got to be really hands-on with it, but there's a lot of different politics involved with this topic, and there's a lot of different governmental regulations that have changed over time, and it was really interesting for us to kind of get hands-on and dig into what that looks like in our country versus other countries and why. So in 1981, the EU basically prohibited the use of any substances that were going to have hormonal action for growth promotions in farm animals. So cows, chickens, all of that kind of stuff, and that started in 1981 just with the EU. Specifically, they were kind of targeting things like 17-beta estradiol, testosterone, progesterone, zeranol, and trenbolone acetate. Then, a little bit later, the US and Canada came back and fought the EU on that decision at the World Health Organization, and they caused that law to get overturned, but then the EU looked back at it again and did some studies and looked at stuff with scientists and decided they were going to reinstate it again. So it's very much been a back and forth kind of controversial topic over the years. But still to this day, the US specifically does not have any laws or regulations on these materials as far as like quantity or anything like that. And one of the really interesting things that we found out was that there's no way of tracking or knowing how much a single cow has. So they don't have a good database of keeping track of this. And when you're purchasing things at the supermarket, there's no way to know, how much of that has. And that was interesting to find out because we actually reached out to the FDA ourselves and found that, and they were not super forthcoming about that information, but we finally found it out. And the big question we were wondering after finding out all of this is kind of why? Why is so much political, back and forth on it, and why are we injecting things like this into beef cattle and not having any way of knowing or tracking how much it is? So that led us to our research aim, which is basically we were trying to quantify and figure out some of the determination of anabolic agents within consumed meat products in Eastern Tennessee specifically. And like I said, I would go over some of the definitions. For the purposes of our study, we defined anabolic agents kind of broadly as just drugs designed for exhibiting positive effects on muscle mass, strength, and recovery. Here we're really focusing on muscle mass because they're kind of beefing these cattle up as fast as possible.
And so just with like sort of any study, you're going to start with a literature review to understand what's already been studied and what's already out there. So for us, we started, and it's not a unstudied topic. It's actually a very fairly common topic that people talk about. However, it's mainly in other countries other than the U.S. currently. So here's just a couple of papers that we found just sort of talking about the hormones that we're consuming in beef cattle. Specifically, this one's in the U.S., but as well as other countries that's looking at this as well, also creating techniques for analyzing this. So here at Maryville, we decided to use HPLC combined with a mass spec. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what HPLC is and then mass spec is. So HPLC, or high performance liquid chromatography, is an analytical technique used to be able to separate compounds out on a column that then is detected through UV vis over the entire spectrum. So for ours, we used reverse phase HPLC chromatography, which is where the column or the stationary phase is actually nonpolar. So we used a C18 column. So it's a silica-based column formed with 18 carbon chains. That way it's completely nonpolar. Our mobile phases are polar phase, and so you have an injector, which is your liquid sample here, that injects it into a flow of mobile phase, and it runs across the column, which allows separation. And this is desirable for specifically complex biological systems such as meat, mush, smoothie-ishness that we're trying to get all the organic material separated out of. And actually, if you tried to run just sort of the meat samples themselves on it, it would not be able to detect it and actually would clog up the line. So it required some sample preparation in on the front end before. However, HPLC is great, but it only allows parts per million detection. And we're really looking for parts per billion detection because they are very small quantity amounts, and they're also very bioactive in humans. So that sort of led to the mass spectrometry, which I'll refer to as mass spec because that's hard for me to say. And that allows for parts per billion detection. And basically, mass spec is just another analytical technique that once you insert a sample into it, it sort of ionizes it and breaks it down into fragments. It then aligns certain molecules, so the heavier molecules, which are not evenly broken apart, will then hit a steel beam or metal wall, which will essentially stop them from making it to the detector, while the magnets in it will still align the well magnet charge ratio ions to hit the detector, which is one of the reasons why it allows such great detection, specifically in the parts per billion, which makes it a great technique for us. And so one way of using both of these together is they actually have an instrument that combines both of them, and that's liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry. And actually ours was a quadrupole mass spectrometry, which is basically, it just has a region that it's specifically trapping it in to look for these ions. However, on the front end, like I said, we have some sample preparation that we had to do. And so that sort of started out as you have meat. We got from 3 different samples. We have a farmer that agreed to allow us to study his meat that actually does use these products, Ralgro specifically. We have a farmer that agreed that he did not use any of these compounds. It's just natural beef, as well as consumer market, like supermarket beef. We would then cut it up. We would weigh out a kilogram of it, or as close to a kilogram as possible, because that's what most studies use. We would then sonicate it to lyse the cells to try and release as much hormone material as possible, and then sort of mix it with a methanol solution to try and separate the hormone out from the cellular debris using a centrifuge, also getting the cellular debris to settle while leaving the hormones suspended in the supernate. From there, we would keep the supernatant and rotovap it and trying to sort of condense as much solvent off of it as possible, and just keep trying to go back and forth to make it as clean as possible, because there is a lot of cellular debris in this, as well as fatty acids, which was an issue we ran into quite often. We was extracting some of the hormones we believed with also a lot of fatty acid. So going back and forth between liquid-liquid extraction, temperature control of chilling, because if you heat your samples too much while you're trying to prepare them, you can run into where the fatty acid will actually go into solution at that temperature, specifically with the rotovap. So that actually led us to having to use solid phase extraction, which is basically the same thing the column is in HPLC, except it's in a little cartridge that you put in a manifold that is pressurized itself, that allows the sample to pass through and sort of clean up your sample before it even hits a column. And from there, then we loaded into our little small syringe HPLC vials. So sort of leading to our results, which is not very much as of right now, because our LCMS unfortunately died at the beginning of our study. Actually, before we even got started, I had some stuff ran in the spring before the summer that we decided to do this work, and it was up and running. We had a estradiol that was actually had data on it, just from a standard perspective. It came back, and then we had a power surge, and the computer system in the LCMS was kaput. So that led to a sort of agreement, or where we started working with UT, specifically their mass spec center there. I worked with Dr. Jones on trying to get these samples analyzed. And that's sort of one of the challenges with research, is it doesn't all go very easily. And as a matter of fact, of going from the driver's seat of this project, so to speak, to not even being inside the car anymore. So sort of trying to push them as fast as possible while they're also still trying to do many other projects, and this project is complicated in its own nature. However, we was able to get some standards analyzed as of right now. It's still an ongoing project, so these next couple of slides are just the standards that we have. And alpha-zeronol, and this is both me and her agreed that these are pretty good standard curves that we've got fitted, with a 0.99 being preferred. However, there is one specifically. It is the estradiol benzoate on the left with a 0.98. That one actually had some tailing occur, which is just a process of where, while it's on the column, it diffuses over a time, and that can lower your sensitivity to that compound specifically. So they're actually currently working on updating the method to try and eliminate some of the estradiol benzoate tailing as much as possible to get that up to a 0.99 R squared value. And then this is 17 beta estradiol and progesterone, all at the 0.99 level as well. However, so that being said, it's still ongoing. I actually am still trying to go back and work some of the meat samples that we currently have. We sent them over, there was analyzed once. It's believed that the sample was lost in the SPE cartridge. So I'm going back and just reflushing those out and going to send it back over to them again. And so hopefully that will work. So we need to still finalize those final results. Incorporate some temperature into the study, so specifically meats. So when you cook a meat, there's some studies that show that it releases some of these compounds cooking them, so it's another way to elevate the study even more. And also, understanding how these quantities or compounds the compounds in such quantities that we're analyzing, how do they affect us developmentally, or how do they affect us just as a human functioning, like what interactions are they having with our body? And so with that, it's going to take us to our thank you to Tim Burchett, the U.S. Department of Education for FIPSE funding, the Scots Science Scholars, Dr. Gibson, Dr. Siopsis, Brett, the National Science Foundation, the Scots Science Scholars, Maryville College for a place to do this research at. As well, I should put on here UT's mass spec facility, and Dr. Jones for helping me in this project, as well as Dr. Crane for his support and guidance on this project.
Ellie. We have one more presentation for everyone today. We're gonna go back to the world of OR&L. We had 2 more mathematics majors. The opportunity to work out there. All right, so our next 2 speakers for today, we have Kyla Pressnell, who is a senior mathematics major, and Tucker Smith, who is a sophomore mathematics major.
Thank you everybody for being here today. So as Brett said, I'm Kyla Pressnell and this is Tucker Smith. So today we'll be talking about how we were interns at Oak Ridge National Lab, and the project we worked on included using TinyML to detect hacks in IoT devices.
So we just wanted to do a little quick how we got into this position. So we had Dr. Siopsis come to us and tell us that there was a grant available that would allow us to get paid and get paid as interns, obviously, through OR&L, through some researchers who needed interns for their projects. There's multiple projects that we were told about, but ultimately they kind of decided on what would fit our majors best, and kind of what would fit our interests best. And so we met with Jeff, Luke, and Ming Yang at the Sutton Science Center to just talk about those projects and kind of meet with them, and they're trying to just decipher who we are as individuals and see what our interests were, as I said. And then ultimately we got placed into the TinyML project.
Okay, so as an overview about what we'll be talking about today, so Tucker is going to be explaining what is ML and TinyML, and then he'll move on to IoT devices and hacking. Then I will be talking about how to detect hacks and performing feature selection. Then we'll move on to some acknowledgements.
So what is ML? Well, that's machine learning, and just a simple definition is a type of artificial intelligence that uses data to train computers. And these computers use algorithms, and then they make predictions based on algorithms. So what does that mean really? Well, to give y'all a simple example is like your spam emails. So what happens is your machine learns based off of what emails you do or don't open, how often these emails come to you. So like, say you subscribe to a newsletter and you ultimately don't end up actually like reading it, or you just don't open it very often. A lot of times these emails will get sent into spam, and this is just a simple like worldview explanation of what machine learning is that you all would be able to maybe understand. And to move into what TinyML is and kind of what we worked on specifically, it is a type of machine learning that allows models to run on smaller computers. These smaller computers, you'll see on Kyla's slide, you'll see like what the device looks like. An example is an Arduino device where it runs off of a battery, and it's just a computer itself. And the type of machine learning algorithm we use were decision trees, where there were inputs in our scenario, it's previous data that we used, but we used previous input data to have it learn what were the previous attacks were, and then later would identify them based on 1, 0, or 2, which also Kyla will show you in a little bit. But in order to even get started using the devices, you have to set it up. So what I'll show you in a second, kind of what some of the processes were, a couple of the processes were when we set up the device. It was actually pretty cool and pretty interesting, because there's a microphone on it, which you wouldn't think there's going to be a microphone on such a small device. There's a microphone, there's actually a camera on it. You're going to see a horrible picture that we took. It's upside down and everything. So the 2 pictures up top are an example of what the microphone was. So when we set it up, you just you clicked it and it would run, and then you, like what we did, we just whistled into it. So the picture on the left side is an example of just raw noise, like there's nothing constant, but then when you whistle, it would create the wavelength frequency which obviously the microphone would pick up. So that was just one of the setups that we used while setting up the Arduino device. And then this picture down here is a picture of the window of the building that we were in. This is kind of like one of those window scent things. So if you like picture it upside down, that'd be like the smell thing, I guess, if that makes any sense. But those are just a couple examples of, you know, what the process was to set up the device to get it going. But ultimately, how would we, you know, why would we start to do this? Why would we need to set up the device in the first place? Well, a lot of times, not a lot of times, you do have the probability that people or other countries in general, like China, they often create our electronics, and so they could input attack data into your devices, and then or sorry, I go way ahead of myself. What are IoT devices? Well, it's just the Internet of Things. So basically that means they're simple devices like your router, your phone, your computer, basically anything that's connected to the internet or will connect to the internet is what an Internet of Thing IoT device is. And so like I said, foreign countries can input attack data into these devices without you really knowing, and then once you unknowingly try to access this data, a function might turn on in order to steal your data. So kind of an introduction to how that might happen. We were introduced to the IoT hacking book. It's called Practical IoT Hacking. And so the example used in this book was a router. And so basically we used bash command to basically hack into data online, into this router data, and basically see what was the country of origin of the router, you know, who used it, what kind of data was inputted through this router, and we were actually able to access their password from it. It's obviously not a great password because it's just an example password, but it's 1234. Right here where it says admin, that was the password we were able to crack from it. But this was just an example, but this is like the process that our group would have used to hack into a device to like start to train these machines to look for this attack data.
Okay, so next we learned about how to detect attacks. So the process we started with is we were given a set of data from a paper called Edge2Guard. So it was given to us by the project leaders, and it was a very large data set. So it had 9 IoT devices with 3 types of hacking attacks and at least 5 subcategories of attacks. So it's a very dense data set. And after we were able to figure it out and see what it included and get comfortable with it, then we started to see if we could train the model and to be able to classify the attacks. So we used a random forest classifier, but there were other methods and algorithms used in that paper, but the one we stuck with was a random forest classifier. So we were able to train the model for attacking the hacks, and then we moved on to classifying the attacks based on 3 different categories of hacks. So as you can see in the output up there, it says benign, Mirai, and Gafget. So those are the 3 categories of attacks. And we were wanting to see if we can run the model to the Arduino, which is pictured down here. So we used, the TinyML we used was technically called Arduino Nano 33BLE. That was the full name for it. And that's what we used down here. So we wanted to see if we can run our code to it to see if we can classify the attacks. The only issue though is we could only get, this is the only output we were able to get because it would take so long to get any kind of output. So it would take at least an hour or so to run anything. So we wanted to see if there would be a better way to run this. It would take less time and would it be so expensive to us. So we moved on to feature selection. We didn't know anything about this, we just want to reiterate that because we were mathematics majors, and so we had to learn all this information. So we want to start out by saying, what is a feature? So that is a variable that you focus on in your research. So it's essentially just a subset of your variables that you're focusing on. And then feature selection is the process of reducing the number of variables so we can still have good accuracy, but hopefully run our model in a shorter time. So there are many ways you can do this. The one that we settled on though was recursive feature elimination. So all this does is it removes features based on their importance. And importance in this situation is just a number that's calculated by the model as it puts it out, and then it's just ranked. And so what I did is I wanted to look at 4 levels of features. So we originally started with 115 features, and that was a lot, and it was taking about 50 minutes for a single line of code to run. So we wanted to see if we can reduce this. So we started with 115 features, then I wanted to look at 10, 15, 20, and then all the way down to 5. So the 20, 15, and 10 were relatively good, but I wanted to focus on the 5 features because if we could eliminate 110 features and cut the time in essentially half, but still have a good accuracy, that was honestly better to me than keeping just a few more. So what we ended up with was this. I just kind of created this table in Excel. So all it really shows is just the 9 different devices that were used in the data set, and then how accurate each one was whenever we ran it through the training model, and it was how accurate it could detect the different hacks. And so essentially, the 115 had pretty much 100% accuracy just because it had so many features, and then if we went down to 5 features, then it was still very high. So this is where we kind of left off with the project because it is actually still ongoing. I talked to Jeff whenever they came to campus a few weeks ago, and it is still going. This was essentially the end of our time at Oak Ridge.
So we just want to give our acknowledgements to the Department of Education for the grant, to Dr. Siopsis, Dr. Jeff Nichols, Luca, Dr. Ming Yang, Dr. Paul Lau, Mike Huddle, and Max Hankins, and Mahim Arthur.
Right, and now we're going to open our questions open to both groups, both the meat experiments. I should come up with a better name for that one. For meat experiments, but yeah, what questions do we have?
For Ellie and Colby, what type, is there a system to find where that consumer meat came from? Like the farms, did y'all look into that at all?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting into with the FDA, and that's like exactly what I asked them basically is like, hey, how can I figure out if I buy this thing of meat that's, 80-20 from Walmart, where did it come from? No. But the suggestion we kind of reached at the end of the summer of like, a lot of people would ask us about our project and be like, okay, so how can we avoid this? What are we supposed to do? Find a local farmer you trust and buy from them as much as you can. That's like the big overarching suggestion. That way you can know as much about your, products that you're getting.
Y'all might have said this. What cut of meat did you use?
So we used, so we had ribeyes and we also had ground beef. So, and there was from, in the consumer market class, there was like higher grade, like the USDA choice versus like so-called tube meat. Like you don't really know what's in it.
And we were also trying to compare like kind of fat levels because we were thinking maybe some of these things that we were looking for would be trapped in the lipids there. So we were comparing different fat levels, and I will say that I don't think it said this on our presentation, but all of the stuff we got was from Walmart. So
question for Tucker and Kyla. I noticed that there was about a half of the time was cut away when you took away essentially 110 extra features. What made those 5 features so intensive on the program that they still required like a relatively long compute time, I guess? Or is there a certain thing that makes a feature more intensive than another?
I think honestly it's more about the amount of data present, I'm pretty sure, if that makes any sense. So like each of the features has like a specific amount of data associated with it, I'm pretty sure. So then
Yeah, I was gonna say also, because some of the attacks, so there was one called Benign, it didn't have as many classifications because that was essentially just base level. So it's possibly something to do with that too, I would say.
Makes sense. Other questions? Any of the other professors have any other questions?
I want to know what this means for you going forward. So, what impact did this have on what you want to do or don't want to do, or any directions? Two of you are seniors, one is close to graduating, and we've got kind of an advanced first year student when you went, right? So, can you talk about that? Can you talk about what this experience meant for you in terms of like what you're thinking now versus what you were thinking before?
I think for our project, I really liked the aspect of like the human health relationship and kind of discovering like a lot of people have that like farm to table mentality. So it was kind of interesting to see if that was something that was real and worthwhile. But one thing I did discover, no offense, Dr. Gibson, was that I did not like the chemistry work and the lab work, and I probably wouldn't want to do that, which is not really where I'm heading in my career anyway, so that's fine.
For me, it's I don't like things to break. I want to be right there doing it. I even tried to like figure out a way to get over to UT and like watch the process and like watch the data itself come out. That's very hard for me, so it just goes to show that I need to be very hands-on when I'm moving forward. So.
Is it a control thing? Did you feel like you weren't controlling?
It was going so slow, and I understand like they're a bigger institution and they're not just analyzing our samples, like they are for hire, so like there's a bunch of samples coming into them all the time, and they were sort of cutting us a deal also to do part of this project because their scientist, Dr. Jones, actually does have an interest in this field, and so I think she got caught up working on things that actually pay well. And I'm like, but I want my data, so yeah.
Well, for me, just being a first year student, it was definitely scary to go into this first because it was definitely in a field that I wasn't fully confident in at first. I took a computer science class here and enjoyed it. Didn't do as great in the class as I wanted to, but also that's just how it starts off at first. You know, you might not be good at it at first, but practice over time makes it perfect. And so being able to do this kind of showed me how I can apply mathematics within a field that within the computer science field, and maybe it's something I want to do in the future. I already have a kind of pathway of what I want to do, but maybe I want to veer off and maybe figure out how I can add computer science and mathematics into an engineering field. So just again, being a first year student, freshman intern, it definitely was a great experience to just dive into something I wasn't fully interested in at first or aware of. So
Yeah, it's honestly similar, even though I was 2 years, I guess, grade-wise older than him. It's still, even that age, something like this, some kind of experience, it just solidified my love for research, I guess. So I knew I enjoyed mathematics and using it in research before, but to see it used in cybersecurity as well, I really enjoy it. And I even used this type of feature selection a little bit in my senior study. So I took that out of it, and I'd like to use that in the future too.
I just have a quick this is for Tucker and Kyla. Do you feel that you had adequate computer science background for what you were doing? You know, I'm aware that there's a lot of computer science in this, and just kind of wondering if you felt like, I know you both were in 130, and Kyla, I think you were in 225 as well. So just interested to hear if you feel like, yeah, it might have helped to have another couple computer science classes.
I mean, it would have helped to have more, but I think I did have a good background for what I was
Yeah.
going into, especially with Python.
Uh-huh.
So thankfully they used a lot of Python.
Yeah,
So I felt pretty good. There was a lot we did learn and a lot we could learn, but I think we had a good background.
I agree. I thought that it was nice. I obviously didn't have that extra class that she had, but I thought what I learned from the class I was able to input into the actual.
And you felt prepared enough for the challenges.
And what was also helpful too is that, like, the whole point of an internship too is also it's a learning point. So
Exactly.
So being able to learn from it as well was really helpful.
That's right.
Well, I think we're out of time for questions, but we should definitely give all of them another round of applause.